Transforming trick weapons from the game known as Bloodborne are some of the coolest things that have ever existed in video gaming history. These weapons, when you press a certain button, transform and become a different type of weapon that you can use in a very similar way sometimes or a very different way. And today I'm going to be breaking down the top 10 most fun, interesting, exciting trick weapons in Bloodborne. This is my list. These are the ones that I find the most fun, most interesting. Obviously, it's a subjective list. This isn't going to be true for everyone, but it is for me, and I hope you enjoy the interesting commentary as I go through my top 10 weapons. Let's get into the list. Starting off, I have a couple of honorable mentions. The first honorable mention that I have today is the Tonitrus. I'm not sure how you say it, but the Tonitrus is a mace weapon. It looks kind of like a mace, but it doesn't have spikes. It's just like a ball on the end of a stick. And its tricked form is the same as its base form, except it can charge itself with lightning, and it becomes a lightning strength kind of weapon. It's super cool. Scales mostly off of strength and the arcane stat. But it didn't make the list because there's a weapon that's very similar to the Tonitrus that I feel like is a little better. We will get into that in just a minute. Another honorable mention is the church pick, which is actually from the Bloodborne DLC. This is more of a skill in arcane weapon, and so it's still for magic users, but also for folks that have a high skill level. And it's basically a spear that transforms into a scythe, which I love scythes, and traditionally those are some of my favorite weapons. And it does have great reach, and there's some fun to be had, but it's rather basic in terms of its move set, and I would like for it to have more, curved slices as a scythe. Good thing that Dark Souls 3 came along after the church pick and gave us some of the best scythes that we've ever seen in a From Software game. Number 10, I'm cheating a little here, are the starter trick weapons. These are the 3 weapons that you can pick at the beginning of the game. The saw cleaver, the threaded cane, and the hunter's axe. All 3 of these weapons are iconic, and they define the first few hours of gameplay in Bloodborne. These weapons also hold up all the way through to the end game. Never before in a Souls or a combat-driven game have I held my same weapon through the entire playthrough, and yet I've had various playthroughs where each one of these weapons has been my weapon that I've continued to use near the end of the game. Now, all 3 of these have satisfying transformations and movesets. All 3 of them can be buffed with bolt paper or fire paper or any of the other buffs, and also all 3 can hold their own damage-wise in the late game. This is incredible because there's so many other weapons that you start off with in games like this that they kind of curb out, but these, no, they still are some of the best weapons in the game damage-wise if you continue to upgrade them and upgrade your skills accordingly. You cannot go wrong with any of these 3 weapons. Saw Cleaver in particular, just an incredible weapon to stick with the entire game. Next up at number 9, we have the Burial Blade. The Burial Blade is another scythe, which obviously I have a soft spot for by this point. And it has, decent scaling with your different stats, and it has very low requirements. So if you've upgraded your skill and strength at all, you should be able to use this upon getting it. Why do I say that? Well, because you do not have access to this weapon until you defeat Gehrman, which is one of the final bosses in the main game. This is one of the smoothest trick weapons in the game. It just feels good. It's kind of like a curved sword and turns into this scythe, and this one does have that beautiful, swinging, flowing scythe movement that you come to love in these games, and it's definitely worth the pickup. It does have the 2 detracting factors that keep it from being higher on this list for me. One, I don't really love that you can't pick it up until your second playthrough. This is a weapon that in this most recent playthrough of Bloodborne that I did, I wanted to use as soon as I could, and I just couldn't. I played through the entire game and the DLC, and then, only then, was I able to pick up the Burial Blade, and I used it on I think my New Game Plus run as I was fighting Cleric Beast and stuff. Super fun. I wish I could have had it earlier. So that's a detracting factor. The other one is, it is a little bit clunky. you have this big old like bending thing hanging on your back the entire time that you're using it until you trick it out and use the scythe form. It is one of the fanciest weapons in the game, but it's not the most stylish, nor is it the best weapon in my opinion. Still worth a pickup if you're going into the New Game Plus mode. Next up we have number 8. This one is the Boom Hammer. Now this is the sole reason that the Tonitrus did not make the list. I remember the first time I went to the DLC, which I've mentioned many times now in Bloodborne, called the Old Hunters. When you enter the DLC, depending on which route you take, one of the first hunters you come across has one of these hammers. And he starts slashing at you, you're like, wow, that's a cool hammer. And then he charges it up and it catches on fire and he slams it and there's a little explosion around it and you're like, wow, that is a cool weapon. I wish I could get one of those. And you do later. But this weapon is so cool, and it's very similar to the Tonitrus. Its tricked out form is actually the same as its base form, except for it boosts itself up with this explosive fire. One key difference is it's not actually on a timer like most buffs are, but the Boom Hammer actually just buffs its next attack. So you press the trick button and you buff it with fire, and then you get one fire attack. And then you can buff it again and another fire attack. And I really liked the way that this makes you think through your gameplay. And it's so much fun. It's deceivingly fast too. It's a strength weapon, and yet it comes in quicker than you think it should, especially that trick attack. You're able to stab forward with a hammer and light it on fire so that your next attack does fire damage. One of the most fun mind games you can play is when do I buff it and when do I slice in with that nice fire damage to get that extra damage on top of what I'm normally doing. It's a great weapon. Next up, number 7, Ludwig's Holy Blade. Ludwig's Holy Blade is a quality scaling weapon. What does that mean? Well, it has high scaling in some multiple departments: strength, skill, and arcane. And its requirements for using it are pretty low as well. However, this is one of the coolest transforming weapons in the entire game. Why? Because it's basically a little sword, a little silver sword that you can slash pretty fast, but when you transform it, it inserts it into a sheath and you begin to swing the scabbard around like a greatsword. This is so cool looking. I mean, the scabbard is way oversized for the size of the little sword that goes in it, but when you pull it out, you understand this is the great sword now, and the feeling you get when you first do it is just amazing. This was my first true love of a weapon in my first playthrough. 2 attacks break this weapon. First of all, the tricked L2. Whenever this weapon is tricked out, the L2 gives you kind of an overhead smash, which, if you're not familiar with Bloodborne, is really important because there are multiple bosses that it helps to be able to kind of fly swatter their head, right? Amygdala, as well as the Watchdog of the Old Lords, both of those are really nice to be able to just aim right for their head, and the overhead cut with the Ludwig's Holy Blade is just so incredible. Secondly, the R2, when it's in the tricked form, is this massive like thrust attack that just slams that scabbard into whatever it is that you're trying to hit. And there's nothing quite like using that thrust attack and hitting an opponent and getting them ready for a visceral attack. Super cool, especially if it's like Watchdog of the Old Lords or something, and whenever you land the thrust, you see that whole head just break open and you get to go up and do the special parry attack on him. Ludwig as a character was an interesting figure, but when you get to wield his sword and cleanse the streets of Yharnam using this massive, sheathed great sword, it just feels right. Next up, number 6, the Kirkhammer. The Kirkhammer is the strength creme de la crop, right? Whatever that phrase is. It's a high strength scaling weapon with not too high of requirements. Now, if you're a fan of Smo, the Executioner from Dark Souls 1, this one will tickle your fancy, right? This is a full-on strength great hammer, complete with just the pounding move set. It's heavy, it's slow, but it packs one of the biggest punches in the game. And its damage scales so well that later in the game, you're able to destroy any boss that has, destroyable body parts, which I know sounds weird if you've never played Bloodborne, but there's all these bosses that you could take out a leg or take out their head and make it where it's they're defenseless for a minute. This weapon does that so well. You do have to think critically about your positioning and your timing because you are slower than most other weapon movesets. However, it is the Chad Dad's dream to just bring this giant hammer down on someone's head time after time. Kirkhammer is a blast. You should get used to it. It's a fun weapon to use, especially as a strength wielder. Number 5, we have the Chikage. The Chikage is a blood tinge build staple. It has low requirements, and it is one of the only handheld weapons, like not the guns, but one of the only sword type weapons that has an S tier scaling in blood tinge. So if you're going to go for a blood build, you must use the Chikage, or at least should try it out. Now, we're in the top 5. This is my 5th best weapon, and the Chikage is one of a lot of people's favorite weapons in the entire game. It is basically just a katana that you can swing really fast, and then when you trick it, it coats itself in blood and does extra damage at the expense of draining your HP just a little bit at a time. Now it hits first like a katana, right? Like I said, but it's a little maybe less elegant than the katanas that say Wolf from Sekiro would use, right? It's a little less elegant, a little less flashy than that. However, when you do coat it in blood and you begin slashing around this bloody katana, the anime vibes go over 9,000 levels of excitement, right? The damage also cannot be overstated. This thing is one of the most powerful potential damage weapons in the game because of how fast you can swing it when it's buffed. Slipping in and out of that blood coating and using it at different times, man, it makes everything in the game feel squishy. And weapons like that are traditionally super exciting and fun to use, especially for someone who likes katanas anyway. So you won't regret this weapon as a pick. Next up, we have number 4, which is the saw spear. Many of you are probably surprised right now why I would put this so high. It's basically a saw cleaver, right? It is, but there's one thing that makes it even better, in my opinion, and that is the range. Now, the saw cleaver, as you remember me saying earlier, is one of my favorite weapons anyway. It's the number 10. Well, this one is number 4 because it is a saw cleaver that has that serrated edge, so it can fight beasts better. It can be buffed just like the saw cleaver, but this one has a unique moveset. Whenever you transform it, it becomes a literal spear. That's why it's called the saw spear. But that transforming attack is one of the best things in the entire game. When you use your R1 and swing the saw spear, and then L1 to transform it, it extends it into a spear. And the range on that transforming attack is so long because it's becoming the long-range spear that you can use for. Now, the spear's moveset is neat, but it is slower because of that longer range. So what I recommend is you use the R1, slash once, and then L1 to trick it out, and then L1 again, and just keep going back and forth between its forms because that range just keeps poking out way further than it should. And this thing gets it goes so fast and it just continues getting all that damage in. It has really good damage as well. It scales pretty well with skill, and it doesn't have very high requirements. Also, you get this weapon in the first hour of the game, depending on what pace you're playing through. Many of us have started playthroughs of Bloodborne, and we picked up this weapon and we thought, it's just, it's another saw cleaver. I already picked the hunter's axe over that, right? So why would I pick this? But you should give this one a try and see what your experience is with me, because it's buffable, it's available early, it's rangy, and it allows you to always be able to parry. It's such a cool weapon. Give it a try before you knock it. Top 3. Next up, the Whirligig saw. The Whirligig saw is a lot of players' number 1 weapon in the game. Now, I'm picking it as number 3. And this is my second DLC weapon in the top 10. But imagine this, right? You have a mace, right? It's a longer mace with a really small head, and it feels like aerodynamic, right? That's the base of this weapon here. It's really cool. But then, when you transform this weapon, your player character reaches over his shoulder, and you know, I don't know if he got this out of the DeWalt toolbox or what, but he has a full-size buzzsaw that he pulls over his shoulder and slams on the end of this mace, and all of a sudden you get the saw on a stick, the Whirligig saw that we're talking about here. The basic moveset is cool. You got these like multi-hit cutting attacks, but what makes this weapon go over the top is when you press L2 in its tricked out form. Because when you do, your character will hold up the saw, jam it forward, and begin to just rev that saw up, and it will continue doing that until you run out of stamina. So if you have enough stamina, you can just cut through all kinds of enemies in the entire game. And not to mention, this thing actually staggers enemies. So even some of the late game beasts that you're fighting on top of Cathedral Ward, or even in the DLC, you can just hold the L2 and cut them until they die. I mean, it's an incredible, super fun weapon to use. The only downside being that you can't parry while it's in the buzzsaw form. It may well be the most unique weapon in the entire Soulsborne Hero Ring franchise, but it's my number 3 for the best weapon in Bloodborne. All right, let's get this one out of the way real fast. Number 2 is the Holy Moonlight Sword. Now, when I first picked up Bloodborne, I used this weapon, and reflecting back on it, I thought to myself, maybe it will make the top 10, maybe it'll be an honorable mention. But since then, I've played with the Moonlight Sword in Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Demon Souls, and Elden Ring. And all of those and all of this experience made me think, I've got to try this again. So in my most recent playthrough, I picked up the sword, and I'm here to conclusively tell you, this is the best rendition of the legendary magic blade that we've ever seen. It starts off as a kind of unassuming and yet really metal looking great sword that has like this little detail around the hilt of it, and it's beautiful, and it slaps pretty hard too. But then when you trick it out, it becomes cloaked in the trademark moonlight, and it gains a projectile attack and a magic infused thrust attack, and it swings, just give you this glowing, sweeping feeling that parallels almost nothing else in the game. You feel like you're cutting through water with how fast you take down enemies using this sword. This sword is one of my very favorite experiences in Bloodborne, and is the best rendition of one of the most classic weapons in all of the Soulsborne extra games world. If you haven't picked this sword up before, go beat Ludwig first, it's hard to do, and then grab this sword and enjoy. And now, it's time for me to reveal my favorite, most fun, most interesting weapon in all of Bloodborne, and that is Logarius' wheel. Now, before you rage out and quit, this is a strength weapon expert's dream. This thing has the legendary S-tiered strength scaling, and it's available in the main game, so you can use it for all of the late game bosses and the DLC bosses. It is so much fun to get your hands on as well. Ever since I played Dark Souls 1, I've been a fan of just like kind of the silly colossal weapons. I remember going through the graveyard in DS1, picking up the Zweihander for the first time, which if you have heard of that weapon, it's one of the most popular in all of Dark Souls. And it's just this colossal great sword that you can bring down and literally flatten enemies. In Bloodborne, that is Logarius' wheel. I've got 3 words for you that you need to become familiar with as you get using this. That is crash, whack, and slam, because that's the feeling that you get every swing with this thing, especially the third attack in a chain, which brings the wheel down on top of other people's heads. Not to mention the fact that the tricked form kind of like revs it up like an engine, you know, and spins the wheel, and then you kind of slice through people. Oh, it's so cool. If you haven't given this one a try, like I said, it's silly, it's zany, but it really does pack a punch, and it's so much fun to get your hands on. And it's my favorite weapon in Bloodborne. Thank you for checking out this long and detailed list of the best trick weapons in the game of Bloodborne. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully I'll have some more rankings coming out soon. But yeah, check back to my channel, subscribe, hit the like button. You know the things to do. Thank you again for checking me out, and we'll talk to you very soon.